Welcome everyone to the March 2018 Soils Network of Knowledge webinar. So I'd like to introduce Steve Morris, and Steve's a biometrician here at New South Wales DPI, and he's located here at Wollongbar. Actually, he's in the office right next door to me, which is a bit weird having a webinar with him. Steve is responsible for supporting DPI research staff with expertise in statistical data analysis and has assisted many soil research projects during the 28 years he's worked for New South Wales DPI. Today he's going to talk to us about the complexities of field research design and lay out the logical case for conducting field research in the recommended manner and show us some of the pitfalls when other approaches are used. And that's why today's webinar is titled Replicated Small Plot Field Experiments, Is the Pain Worth the Gain?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Abigail, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Yes, I've been offered this soapbox, I guess you'd call it, virtually to talk about field experiments, how we conduct them in DPI, and what's the logical rationale for doing them in this way. Trying to keep it as maths-free as possible because I know that's fairly traumatic for a lot of people, and really explaining the logical ground-up case for doing things in a particular fashion. To launch straight into it, a typical example of what we're talking about presents like this. You can see small plots of ground, literally a handful of meters wide and a double handful of meters deep, each amended with some product. And a credit to Lucas Van Sweeten and his team here at Wollongbar for providing this ideal photograph of this type of thing. Just to decode some of those colors for you. There we go. Each patch of ground is a different color representing an amendment that was placed there. So the whitish patches had a lime application put on it. The bare, obviously no application of anything, and the ashy looking ones were indeed covered with ash or biochar in two different species or brands. It's not really relevant to what I want to talk about, but I should add for completion that groups of 4 plots had a low nitrogen fertilizer application across the top, and neighbouring groups of 4 also had a high application of nitrogen there. Look, so this is typical of many fields of research, both in soils and in cropping, within DPI and across Australia, and indeed, across the world. This model is pretty well accepted for doing things, but it does get, what's the word? Feedback, blowback, if you like, argumentation. People tend to think these things are far too complex, certainly expensive if you think about the labour component of setting out something like this, carting material from place to place, particularly on, I'm told, very hot days where conditions are not conducive to physical activity. Staff might go to their boss and say, why are we doing it in this way? And the boss might say something like, the statistician is making us do it. Which is blame shifting in my view. You also get this view that this is a very artificial model of this system, in the sense that it operates over a small space and no one really works in small plots. I have a quote that's burnt into my brain from a client several years ago who said, this isn't real. And I work with farmers, and farmers only understand real things, and this isn't real, which is kind of condescending towards farmers a little, and indeed hurtful to the finer feelings even of statisticians. So a good opportunity just to go through the ground up logic of how these things work, I thought. What is real in the mind of that person and potentially of others? What does that look like when we're looking to evaluate 4 different amendments? Perhaps it looks like this. Is this more real? Big, proper paddocks. You get big tools out there. You spread the amendments, you look at the yields, you've got 4 numbers to look at instead of 36, and may the best treatment win. Is that a real alternative to what I've just described on the previous slide? So let's break down this model and try and build up the first model. To do that, I really went back to the origins of this thinking. Ronald Fisher in 1926 wrote this paper. He wrote 2 books that were massively influential in how science was conducted in the 20th century, and still to this day, many of his ideas have not been seriously contradicted. And in that, he spoke of many things, but I'd just like to pick on one thread and give my take on how he worked up the justification for doing replicated, randomized, interwoven plot experiments. He opened with a hypothetical situation, 2 acre paddocks side by side, one untreated and one manured. Manured in the 20s being code for all kinds of products, you know, not necessarily squirted from a cow. Let's just say that the manured acre, hypothetically, after harvest showed a 10% increase in yield compared to the untreated acre. What then do we say about that 10%? What guarantees are offered? Do we have any questions about that estimate of yield increase under manure? I certainly have questions. If I was a consumer, I'd be asking what confidence can I have in that 10% increase? Indeed, if I was a little skeptical, could the plot have gained that kind of yield return without manuring? Could there be some other explanation for the 10% gain? Fisher offered 3 explanations or justifications for the 10% that might come out. Which were these? The first was that land was chosen fairly. Second, no reason to expect 1 acre to be better than any other. And the third, never seen these 2 specific acres differ by 10%. He dismissed the first 2 out of hand pretty well, for obvious reasons that I won't go into for time saving. And we'll just deal with the third one there. Never seen these 2 acres differ by 10%. If you're a little skeptical, and if you've had any statistical training at all, the 2 go hand in hand, you might question that never term, and you might ask, how many years exactly have you been watching this system? I mean, how many times do you toss heads with a coin before you conclude you will never toss a tail? So how many years? Fisher proposed, let's say, the 10% increase is the largest observed over 20 manure-free years. That 10% then estimates the 5 percentage point. In that, change this large or better is expected only 5% of the time in an untreated environment. Therefore, the conclusion is a coincidence has occurred. We just happened to treat our paddock in the season where we would have got a 10% increase anyway, or there is something in the manure that caused that 10% increase. Again, if you've had any statistical training at all, you will recognize 5% as a number of power in this space, and this is certainly one of the early uses of that figure in stats. Is 20 years enough? You can imagine that in repeated sets of 20 years, maybe that 10% doesn't show up on top all the time. Maybe in particular sets of 20 years, it is 3rd top, 4th top, and so on, because remembering that every season is worth 5% of your sample. So he blew it out. He said, let's go out to 500 years of uniform treatment. And if the 10% change is in the top 25 differences, somewhere in that top 25 with uniform treatment, the probability of that event is less than or equal to 5%, 0.05. Either there is something in the treatment or a coincidence has occurred. And this is a quote in bold there, reasonable grounds for calling the result significant. One of the early uses of that word significant in association with what still, by definition, could be a coincidence. And certainly that language was widely adopted almost immediately and still used today. Okay, so 500 years of uniform treatment required before we know where that 5% point is going to be, where our benchmark is. Difficult to achieve. Must we do 500 years of uniformity data, he asked, asking himself. 10 might be okay. He did a little bit of maths, but it's accessible. You've got to work through it. Define this thing called a standard error, which might bring back bad memories for some viewers, but anyway, just a number that measures the spread of observed differences between untreated acres over 10 seasons. He derived some results that said if the 10% increase was several times greater than the standard error, as derived from those observed differences, the effect would be significant under that 5% definition. So from 500 to 10. This is a quote from the paper. It would be exceedingly inconvenient if every trial had to be preceded by a succession of 10 uniformity trials. Obtain, and then this is a quote as well, and emphasis is mine on valid, obtain a valid estimate of error, the standard error, by repeated plots in one season. That right there is how we built this idea of doing repeated, replicated plots of each treatment within the one space. If you don't want to do that, then it comes back to where do you get that estimate of standard error from in that environment, and that would only come from, as he says, 10 years of uniformity studies. So he's sort of doing a reverse auction almost, a bit of salespersonship going on here. 500 years, oh what, no way. 10 years, oh okay, we could do that maybe, but, or you could just do it in one time, if and only if you do it with repeated plots. So that's the justification for repeated plots. There is a loophole in that, and it looks a little like this. Let's just do what we were going to do anyway, area A versus area B, and sort of subdivide it into these pseudo plots and take measurements of each and estimate our standard error through the differences between those plots treated alike. In this condition, if you can imagine something as simple as a fertility gradient going through there, or a lens on one side, not on the other, some condition in A that was not in B, you can see that the estimate of error will decrease by such a systematic arrangement of the plots. And therefore, Fisher introduced the idea of randomizing the treatment to the small plots. An example of that looks like this. And with a judicious selection, you can spell the name of a Swedish supergroup from the 70s, but that's not important right now. A random selection will give a valid estimate of that standard error in the long run, give you confidence that you've estimated that 5% point, and you are indeed talking about a significant difference in the Fisherian sense. He further introduced the idea of blocking. So as a tool or a mechanism to ensure that each treatment experiences the full gradient of the environment in the space that you're working with, he launched the idea of dividing the plots into what he called blocks, big enough to cover the number of treatments that are desired, and then randomly allocating the two treatments within each block. So idea plots within blocks are randomized to the treatments. That idea does extend if this sort of thing is too disruptive or invasive within a single environment or farm. And thanks to, I think it was Kathy out there who posted this question pre-seminar, the idea extends to this sort of on-farm, multi-farm trials. Same principles, in that if you can't afford or don't want to do that within a farm, you could find multiple farms and do the same sort of thing. And the same theory works. The same thinking is just being spread out over a wider geographic space. Yeah, clearly there are risks to that, in that as you change or as you move over a bigger gradient in the environment, you may be less likely to see a treatment effect that works really well in some environments but not in others, but it's certainly a good place to start. Okay, so back to our small plot field experiment. I've got some data from it. I'd just like to show you how those ideas really helped produce solid results from this trial. So these are the yields from that particular experiment. Across the horizontal axis there, I'm looking at pasture yield, tonnes per hectare, ranging from a little under 7 to a bit over 9.5 there. Vertical axis shows the treatment labels, the nil, the liming, the char B and char A. The hollow circles represent the observation taken from a single plot under each treatment. The heavy circles are the average of the group of plots that had that treatment. These whiskers represent plus or minus 2 of those standard errors that we talked about earlier. And seeing a pretty clear effect of char A to improve productivity of the pasture in this system at that time, with char B a distant second and then the liming and the nil third. I'd like you to direct your attention to something interesting about this plot, which is these. You might question why every treatment had one observation that was quite a distance below par and a very similar distance below par. And the answer lies in the environment that this trial took place in. Specifically, those results were taken from a cluster of plots at the back or lower part of the trial. And for reasons I don't want to go into in great detail, those specific plots had clear issues in terms of their ability to produce pasture. What saves the trial is the fact that we had repeated applications of the treatment across the environment. Therefore, we're getting a more realistic estimate of what the middle observation would be from each treatment under this environment. And the only reason we've been able to do that, and the only reason we've been able to derive these measures of confidence, is through the repeated and random application of plots throughout the space. Let's think about the strip plot model that people who want to work in the real world proposed. Let's superimpose it over that space. Char A might have got that bad area. Char A then goes from our best treatment to being our worst, based on a very arbitrary decision to place it in that spot. The logic looks like this. Let's put char A in the loser section and no one will ever know. And even yourself, as the person who did that, may not know that that was a bad spot. It will not show up in the data. It'll show up as a pure char A effect. So right there, you know, writ large is a living example of why these principles work out in the field, and why, you know, if I could reflect back on the title, why the pain tends to be worth the gain. Ultimately, and they asked me for a snappy take-home message, science is hard, you know, strap on a helmet if you want to engage in this space, but also the art of field experimentation, as defined by Fisher, is to change the factors of interest. These are your treatments, but control for the factors that are not of interest, which is those environmental gradients, those other factors that are going to change your yields or your response of interest and potentially interfere with the response to the factors that are of interest to you. So if you were going to build up a model from the ground up, how do you answer these goals? How do you produce a good field experiment? I'd like to believe that that you would come to something like the model that Fisher and myself and many statisticians recommend for doing this sort of thing. I think that covers it. There you go. There's a note from our sponsors.
That's it.
And thanks, Abigail, for the opportunity. And thanks, Lucas and team, for the nice pictures and data.
Thanks, Steve. Brief is fine. I think that means we have a little bit more extra time for questions, so that's fantastic, or comment. Did you have anything more to add, Steve, about the question that came from Kath around doing long paddock plots as opposed to fully randomised?
Yeah, that if you wanted to Google up on-farm trials, that is certainly a model that a lot of people put out there, just A versus B within each farm across a range of farms. Can be a way to work around the disruption and indeed the expense that these smaller plot experiments do incur. Yeah.
Okay. What about the stuff where, you know, a reseller or even an advisor will say, do a test strip? surely that means that sometimes your test strip can be in that's, in the spot that's not going to yield any difference. Is that an issue?
You'd want to be very skeptical about results that came from that type of experiment, I think. Given what I've seen in the world, given my experiences, yeah, a test strip would be indicative of, it'd have to be a very gross effect, wouldn't it, really, to convince you that an observation of that size could occur outside what nature could have delivered.
Yeah.
Without treatment, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the process is to be skeptical, to question it. Are there other explanations for that result possible? Oh, where was that test strip? Oh, it was under the trees. Oh, I see. Or it was next to the rabbit warren, or it was, where the rosellas like to come in and graze, There's always alternate explanations for any given result under that test strip, controlled strip sort of model. And the aim of experimentation should be to eliminate those questions as much as you can.
And I think that's a good point. I think lots of people make claims, and it's good to question those and, how robust they are because of how they've been determined. Steve Kimber here at Wollongbar has a question. Off you go, Steve.
Thanks for that presentation, Steve. That was great. Just, I guess, more a comment than a question, but even just recently, I've got the old two-paddock trick where someone's put an amendment out on one paddock and compared it to the next one, and generally you can't speak to these people because they've seen this fabulous result, and you're not going to convince them. But the other thing is teasing out what the cause of the effect is, and a classic is when people are putting on an amendment like biosolids, where if you put 100 tonnes of biosolid on, you're putting a few millimetres of water onto the paddock. So they're attributing an effect to the wrong factor, because they don't really have a true control. They don't balance out the water in the two treatments. I guess consultation with a bionutrition would help sort of tease out a few of these effects before the experiment started?
Yeah, certainly we develop a healthy sense of skepticism through a lot of contacts like that, and you've made a great point there, Steve. Thank you. Indeed, you look at treatments that are applied in solution where you're effectively irrigating your crop. What do you compare that back to? An unirrigated crop? I know that happens. And is that a fair contrast? So, look, it comes back to questioning everything you see. Ultimately, what kind of answer do you expect from one trial in one season in one location? I mean, science is a building process. It's a knowledge gaining process. Very rarely do you have a hard result gained in a single observation from a single spot. So yeah, there's I guess a network of factors that need to be considered when you're looking at any specific claim or database claim. People like to say they've got hard data, hard scientific data. How hard is it? How scientific was it? These are questions that, people could be asking as easily as I ask them.
Good point.
Just I've got a reputation.
All right, so we have
got being a little blunter.
No, that's all right. We have some more questions, which is great. Claire Edwards has asked, how many replications versus treatments is ideal?
Enough, right? So based on experience, isn't it? It's based on your knowledge. What size is the standard error that you've expected based on your knowledge and experience in this space? That determines the replication level. I don't have stronger guidance than that. You can do it theoretically, but you do have to propose or predict what the treatments are going to do to your response of interest. If you can come up with a solid prediction, you can reverse engineer a recommended replication level, and I can talk to anyone through that on a side channel. No worries at all.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
I'm trying to keep it all maths free.
No, that's all right. Amanda Chappelle also has a good question. How do you account for the effect of a neighbouring treatment? So, for example, if you had one treatment that had improved water infiltration and that benefited the next treatment plot. So I guess that's about buffer zones and things.
Very much buffering. Comes back to your knowledge of the system that you're applying. You said a lot with spray-based treatments. How far does that spray drift, and is that spray drift likely to influence neighbouring plots, and what physical distance should I put between those plots to make them less at risk of that? And that comes down to the physics and the chemistry and the specific treatments that you're putting in the ground. And it can be quite subtle.
And your sampling techniques within the plot as well?
Yeah, people talk about internal buffers. So you treat a large area but only measure a smaller area in the center of the plot. And that's equivalent, isn't it, really, to having a wide untreated space between the plots. It really is a matter of picking up a distance in meters that says this space is not affected by what I did in the space next door, as much as I can.
Yep. And we've got another question from Phil Cranny. He says, got any hints on setting up a trial, reducing time, measuring up, etc., getting the replicant square? Are there any time savers that can help us?
Look, I'm proud to be hands-off in how these things come on the ground. I do apologise that I just don't have any hard advice, but look, I'm sure there's a network out there that could help you with some speedy ways to set out the pegs in the ground, definitely.
Yeah, I think
string lines and all that.
Yeah, Phil, if you give me a call, I think we probably have some technical officers here within the department who could help you with that sort of stuff. Oh, and Corinne Celestina has said, are there fee-for-service statisticians and biometricians that the average person can access to assist with experimental design and analysis? Good question.
Yeah, certainly in DPI we can have that conversation, and certainly most universities these days have a statistical consulting unit that you can approach as well. I know UNSW, for example, has a pretty solid base there. I believe University of Queensland as well, a few others. So yeah, Google's your friend.
That's a good question, because I think, you know, some of the stuff that's done in smaller scales for, I don't know whether, you know, land care groups or whatever, and they may not have that expertise. So to be able to access us, that's really useful.
Yep. Oh yeah, a number of private companies I should add as well. I couldn't give you names, but there are a number of, you know, companies have built businesses around quantitative data analytics and consulting. So again, yeah, shop around.
Okay. Oh, and Amanda's got one more. What's a good coefficient of variation to use in soil experiments? Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, that's maths again. Look, I'd hate to give a number. Like, people throw around 10%. If you've hit 10%, you've got a reasonable small standard error relative to your treatment effect. But you know, there's no rule that I'm aware of.
Yeah, she said they use 20% as a rough guide. Be interesting to know where that came from. Yeah.
It's rule of thumb that people have developed. You know, under a system where we see that sort of estimate, we are getting results that we can interpret and we find them repeatable. It really is about estimation more so than significance testing. What is the true effect of this crop or treatment? What is our confidence in that? And building that through good experimental design techniques.
Okay, yeah, all right. She's just getting a bit more of a qualification. I think she's saying they use 20% where they have ripped or clay modified soils. So presumably they've worked out that that's a good number.
Yeah, just to clarify for everyone, the coefficient of variation is that standard error I referred to divided by the mean. And again, it's, you know, which mean are you dividing by to get that 20%? If you're looking at a range of mean responses from an experiment, is it the highest or the lowest, or is it the trial average? So, you know, it's a little grey, that whole, if my CV is 20%,
Yeah.
I'm golden, you know. Just
Yeah.
again, comes back to healthy skepticism and questioning the
And
results
how
that are
many data
given
points
to you.
and all sorts of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. All that feeds into that particular statistic, the coefficient of variation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for asking those really good questions. I think it's really
Yeah, it was great.
useful. And Phil has made a suggestion that perhaps Nathan Ferguson and Jim Vergona, who I think Nathan used to work for DPI, have a ready trial setup method. So maybe we'll get them in to talk at a webinar about how they do that. So if you want to mention that in your exit survey as a possible future topic that you'd be interested in, do that. That would be great. And Mark Arundel's made a comment which is quite good. So I'll read out what Mark wrote. Steve, you're accepting that classical statistics is applicable and valid. So soil is a multivariate entity. Why not use non-linear statistics?
Well, in what sense? I mean, yeah, we're working off different dictionaries, I think, in terms of classical statistics, non-linear stats. Obviously, Mark has some definitions on that I don't automatically carry. Certainly, soil is a heterogeneous space. Maybe Mark's talking about spatial analysis, and certainly that fits into the type of thing I've been talking about. To do such an analysis, you still need to be arranging plots under these principles or something similar. Where it all gets non-linear, I'm not very sure in this particular context of you know, a treatment response type scenario that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So maybe if Mark wants to follow up on a side channel or.
Yep. All right. He said it's more about the interpretation of the data, but yeah, maybe if he wants to talk to you more about that, he can.
Mark sounds like an interesting guy. Let's have a chat, Mark.
So there, Mark, I might direct you directly to Steve's email, which is right there on that slide that everyone can see, hopefully. So if you want to further that conversation, that would be a good avenue. So I will take this opportunity to thank Steve very much. I think that's really useful information for, you know, either end of the research and trial process, if you like, whether you're setting up one or whether you're assessing some information that's come across your desk. Thank you all for attending. Bye.
Thanks all.